Hello everybody, I am Jared Ross, the GeneaVlogger, and welcome back to another Professional Genealogist Reacts. On today's video, I'll be reacting to What Can DNA Tests Really Tell Us About Our Ancestry by Prosanta Chakrabarty. This is off of the TED Ed channel, so I'm hoping that this will be really high quality. This was actually posted by a couple of genealogy friends. I saw it posted on Twitter, so if other genealogists were posting it, I imagine it's going to be a fairly high quality video, which a lot of TEDx and TED Ed videos usually are. So we'll see, but before we jump into the video, please be sure to give this a thumbs up. It really does help me out. Also, be sure to subscribe and click that bell for notifications. And if you'd like to check out a lot of these reaction videos and some other videos, as well as other benefits early, you can go onto my Patreon and become a patron. But with that all said, let's go ahead and jump right into the video. Let's go.
Two sisters take the same DNA test. The results show that one sister is 10% French, the other 0%. Both sisters share the same two parents and therefore the same set of ancestors. So how can one be 10% more French than the other?
Recombination.
Tests like these rely on our DNA to answer questions about our ancestry. But our DNA actually can't tell us everything about who we are or where we're from. DNA tests are great at answering some questions, like who your parents are, but can provide baffling results to others, like whether you have ancestors from a particular region. To understand why, it helps to know where our DNA comes from in the first place. Each person's DNA consists of about 6 billion base pairs stored in 23 pairs of chromosomes, 46 total. That may seem like a dizzying amount of information, but 99% of our genome is shared among all humans. The remaining 1% contains everything distinct about an individual's ancestry. Commercial DNA tests utilize less than 1% of that 1%. One chromosome in each pair comes from each parent. These halves join at conception when a sperm and egg, each with only 23 chromosomes, combine. The story of our ancestry becomes muddled before conception. That's because the 23 chromosomes in a sperm or egg aren't identical to the chromosomes of every other cell.
Recombination. I talk about recombination all the time.
46 chromosomes to a sex cell with only 23, the chromosomes within each pair swap some sections. This process is called recombination, and it means that every sperm or egg contains single chromosomes that are a unique mashup of each pair. Recombination occurs uniquely in each sex cell, making two sisters' chromosomes different not only from their parents, but from each other's. Recombination happens before conception, so you get exactly half of your DNA from each parent. But going further back, things get more complicated. Without recombination, you would get a quarter from each grandparent, an eighth from each great-grandparent, and so on. But because recombination happens every generation, those numbers vary. The more generations removed an ancestor is, the more likely they won't be represented in your DNA at all. For example, without recombination, just 1/64th of your DNA would come from each ancestor 6 generations back. Because of recombination, that number can be higher, though we don't know for sure how high. Or it can be as low as 0. So one sister isn't more French in the sense of having more ancestors from France. Instead, the French ancestors are simply more represented in her DNA. But the story doesn't end there. The tests don't trace the DNA of the sister's actual French ancestors. we don't have access to the genomes of deceased individuals from previous generations.
But so many genealogists would love to have that. And there are efforts to try to do that without actually digging up ancestors, although it's only going to be for recent ancestors, and that mostly includes what's known as touch DNA. And that would be things like if you had a letter with the envelope that your great-grandfather wrote, and you think that he licked the stamp, you can send that in, and then that can be tested at specific companies, and you may be able to get a DNA profile for your great-grandfather from that. Although you have a lot of complications, including degradation, which means that you're not getting the full amount that they're testing for like you would if you're testing your own DNA. And it's very possible it might not be your great-grandfather. But I do actually have a video where I talk about this with Blaine Bettinger, who has tried that out a couple of times, although I don't think successfully. But that's the exact kind of testing that is done for forensic genetic genealogy, which I do for my profession. And I can tell you that we get pretty good profiles out of evidence that's really old. Some stuff going back to the 80s, 70s, even older. Although it's the further back you get, the more degraded the DNA gets, the less of a chance that there is viable DNA that you could use that will give you a suitable profile for comparison. But, you know, I think it's every genealogist's dream in one way, even if, you know, we all realize it's really not a good thing, but we all kind of dream of like getting a swab from our ancestors' remains, or, you know, something to get a profile for them. And sometimes for historical reasons or different reasons, bodies will be exhumed for that very reason, often for identification purposes, but sometimes for other things.
Instead, these results are based on a comparison to the DNA of people living in France today. The tests look for genetic markers or combinations of genetic markers. These markers are short sequences that appear in specific places. The sister deemed more French shares genetic markers with people currently living in France. The assumption is that these shared markers indicate ancestors from the same place, France. It's important to note that results are based on people who've had their genomes sequenced, 80 to 90% of which are of European descent. Many indigenous peoples are barely represented, if at all. The test won't reveal heritage from people not represented in the database, and shouldn't be used to prove race or ethnicity. And as more people get sequenced, your results might change.
One thing that's interesting is the different databases can sometimes be more useful for people of different ancestral backgrounds. So like one database that I always suggest for someone where they say that they have an ancestral background in Eastern Europe, especially like Ukraine, Russia, Moldova, Romania, you know, all of those places, I always suggest MyHeritage, because MyHeritage has different centers out in Europe which can get tests out to the Eastern European populations. So there's a lot more people in that database from the Eastern European countries. So if you have Eastern European ancestry, you're going to have more Eastern European matches through MyHeritage more likely. I'm sure it's the same with some other ancestral backgrounds with the other databases. I don't know every single ancestral background and which database is best for them. Some databases, like for someone who's Jewish, any of the databases will be useful because there are a lot of people with Jewish ancestry on all of the databases. So it can vary, but then on top of that, it also comes down to what populations have been studied, what populations have an actual scientific paper behind that study, which then can be used by the companies to create these ethnicity admixture estimates, which, as they're saying, always changes. So let's go back a little bit.
And as more people get sequenced, your results might change. Looking further back, you may get a result like 2% Neanderthal. Though Neanderthals were a separate species from humans, That 2% doesn't come out of the 99% of our genome shared among all humans, but the 1% that varies. That's because about 40,000 years ago, certain human populations interbred with Neanderthals, meaning some people alive today have Neanderthal ancestors. Many Neanderthal ancestors, in fact. There are so many generations in 40,000 years that a single Neanderthal's genetic contribution would be untraceable. You can be both 100% French and 2% Neanderthal. Though both come from the 1% of DNA that makes us different, they're accounting for different things. Looking for traces of our ancestry in our DNA gets complicated very quickly. Both the way we inherit DNA and the information available for testing makes it difficult to say certain things with 100% certainty. When you think of the discovery of DNA, you probably think of two names, Watson and Crick, but there is a third, unsung
Rosalind Franklin,
whose name you should know. Get the story of the woman behind the double helix with this video.
Yeah. All right. I gotta say that was a pretty good video in terms of explaining how how recombination works, explaining why people may not get the same readings as their siblings, explaining how the population groups are used to define how they come up with your admixture. I thought that was great. I definitely understand why a lot of my genealogy friends were sharing it. I do wish they talked a bit about the genetic relatives part, because one problem with the genetic tests for most people is that they hear about how the admixtures aren't really 100% and they can't really tell you your full ancestry, but often that leaves people with a bad taste in their mouth, but then they don't understand that. But when you get a genetic match on there, so someone else who's tested and it says that you share, 10% of your DNA, which would be a high amount, but if, you're sharing 5% of your DNA with someone, they're going to be a relative of yours, a decently close relative. So, that part is like solid science. Like, it's for sure. It's not like the admixture where they're not quite sure. But I thought that video was great. I was pleasantly surprised. Well, thank you so much for checking out this video. I do hope that you enjoyed. If you did, please be sure to give it a thumbs up. You can also click right about here if you'd like to subscribe. It's completely free to do so. You can also follow me on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram at GeneaVlogger. I'm the GeneaVlogger. I'll see you in my next video.